Morning and good afternoon here in Europe. Greetings from Rome. This is Professor Alberto Garcia, the Dean of the Faculty of Bioethics at the Regina Apostolorum University in the city of Rome, and the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights. Welcome to this webinar, and we are very happy to deal with a very controversial and very important topic, that is the use of psychedelics and the ethics of psychedelics. For this purpose, we have the honor to have with us Dr. Matthew W. Johnson. Welcome, Matthew, for joining us, and thank you also, Ana Maria Ganev, a researcher and member of the staff of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights, that will introduce the topic and will raise also interesting questions to our special guest. This Observatorio Culturale de Bioetica, this observatory, cultural observatory in bioethics, tries to offer an approach to very cutting-edge topics related to health and life, that is in bioethics, but especially about how we should behave in the use of this technology, or in the clinical ethics, or even in environmental ethics. Today, the topic moves in the area of the use of psychedelics. And recently in June, the World Health Organization published a report on the use of drugs, and some of the aspects in this report mention also the use of psychedelics and the use of psychedelics for therapeutic purposes and for other purposes. I hope you will enjoy this meeting, this webinar, and I give the floor to Ana Maria Ganev to introduce herself, and then our special guest. Welcome to the Cultural Observatory in Bioethics, and enjoying.
Thank you, Alberto. As said by Alberto, my name is Ana Maria Ganev. I'm a PhD candidate at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum, and I collaborate with the UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and in Bioethics and Human Rights. So I'd like to greet all the attendees today. We are pleased to welcome you to our academic webinar. As said before, it's called Navigating Psychedelic Frontiers, Bioethical Challenges. And in today's session, we have the privilege of engaging in a thoughtful conversation about the ethical use of psychedelics with Dr. Matthew Johnson, a distinguished professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins University. So Dr. Johnson's expertise in this field is truly exceptional, and his insights promise to illuminate the ethical considerations surrounding psychedelics. So we are grateful for your presence here today and look forward to stimulating and informative discussion. So welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Ana Maria. It's really a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's begin by defining our scope first of all. So could you provide a brief overview of what psychedelics are and why they have gained such a significant attention in recent years?
Well, first I'll acknowledge that even experts disagree on even what counts as a psychedelic. I hold that the word psychedelic encompasses multiple pharmacological classes of drugs. The thing that unites all of them, I would say, is that they, compared to other drug classes, they can have a relatively profound effect on one's perception of reality, including one's sense of self. And within those broad collection of different classes are the so-called classic psychedelics. These are drugs like LSD, psilocybin, which is in so-called magic mushrooms, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, which is in the South American sacrament ayahuasca, and mescaline, which is in the peyote cactus and some other cacti that have been used sacramentally. These act in a certain common way, activating a subtype of serotonin receptor in the brain, the so-called serotonin 2A receptor. But then there are other drug classes that are also, I think, rightfully called psychedelic. There are the drugs like ketamine, which work on the NMDA system, receptor system in the brain. So these are NMDA antagonists. And there are other ones. I won't go through the long list. Probably one of the other most common ones is MDMA, which is, in terms of the common drugs that are used, it's sort of in a class by itself. It also works on the serotonin system, but in a primarily different way. It releases natural serotonin, but at an unnatural rate. It releases a lot of the stored up serotonin and in brain neurons into the gap between brain neurons. And so, but all of these drugs have that sort of relatively profound effect on one's sense of reality. So that's what we mean by psychedelics. And I think the other part of your question, reminding, was, did you want me to describe kind of where we're at with the research?
Yes, why they have such a significant attention in recent years. I mean, the
Right.
famous renaissance of psychedelic studies.
Right. So the so-called renaissance of psychedelic studies started back in about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, depending on where you place the starting line. But there was a very small number of labs. There was one in the United States and New Mexico, and there was one in Germany and one in Switzerland that was doing work back in the mid 1990s, late 1990s, that started this research using psychedelics in humans again. After at least a couple of decades, research was going on with primarily LSD, but also other psychedelics in humans from the mid 1950s through the early 1970s. And then because of the abuse of psychedelics, the use of psychedelics recreationally or outside of medical research, the drugs were made illegal, and they're still illegal, but it was more than the illegality that stopped the research. It was really a cultural shift, the idea that these drugs were so dangerous that you couldn't even do research with them. They were so risky that you couldn't even trust scientists with them. And so, really decades passed before regulators in different countries started allowing this research again. And it was a long time, I think, before even researchers wanted to apply for those approvals again, largely because it was stigmatized. It was really considered a career killer. Like you wouldn't have, if you were a young scientist that wanted to do this work back in the 1980s, your professor, your academic advisor would say, "You're crazy. You're not doing it here. Haven't you heard of, Timothy Leary at Harvard, who was sort of, became the poster child for why you couldn't even trust, researchers and scientists." And so it really took a long time for that to change. And so over the last 20 years, there's been this increasing amount of research, including therapeutic research. So the main things so far have been using psychedelics, and mostly psilocybin in the mushrooms, mostly psilocybin in these studies, but to treat cancer-related distress. So these are people who have existential anxiety about their potential or their coming death. And that was one of the earlier research domains in the 1960s. There's also the treatment of depression outside of cancer. So what you call major depressive disorder. And there is the treatment of different addictions or substance use disorder. So I've done research for over a decade with tobacco addiction, using psilocybin to help people quit cigarette smoking, people who have tried to quit and been unable. There's also some really promising research in the United States using psilocybin to treat alcohol use disorder or alcoholism. And so it's because of those. So, and broadly speaking, the findings from these studies have been really promising. Really, for all of the ones I've mentioned, the success rates have been, not 100%. Nothing works for everyone, but they have been substantially higher than what we typically see in typical medications or other treatments for these disorders. So I think over time that's generated a lot of excitement. And I will say, we'll probably come upon it, but I will say that it's not just giving the drug. There's a lot of preparation. It's screening. It's not for everyone. It could be dangerous for certain people. So there's a lot of screening. In other words, selecting who might be dangerous for this, so we make sure they're not treated. And there's preparation and there's monitoring. This isn't sending people home with it. So there are dangers, but all of this research I've described has done a lot to recognize and to minimize those dangers with safeguards.
So could you delve more on the mechanism of action of these substances, and more specifically their physiological effects and also psychological effects, and also what do they do with the sense of self?
Well, one thing to note regarding the safety, that for the classic psychedelics like psilocybin, at the physical level, they're remarkably safe. There are some dangers, but they're really minimal compared to most drugs, even compared to caffeine. Now, to be clear, I would never call any drug just safe, 100%. So there are dangers, but they're mainly psychological for these drugs, not physiological. It does appear that people that are at very severe risk of heart disease can be harmed by something like psilocybin, the classic psychedelics, because they raise your pulse and your blood pressure relatively modestly, but even that can be dangerous for someone at severe heart disease risk. So there is an exception. But for most people, most healthy people, there's no known lethal overdose. It's not going to make your liver stop working. It's not going to make you stop breathing. It's not going to give you for most people, it's not going to give you a heart attack or a stroke. The way that most drugs, if you dig too much, will kill you, whether it's alcohol or illegal drugs, they'll kill you by one of those ways if you take enough of it. So they're relatively safe at the physical level, but they have a profound effect mentally. And at high doses, a really overwhelming effect. And that's really what is notable about these drugs, is that you can give a dose that's, again, relatively safe, that has just this profound effect. I mean, people will not always, but often describe it as the most intense experience of their life. And sometimes people will say it's the most meaningful experience of their life. Sometimes people will say it's the most frightening experience of their life. So this is all, it can be extremely intense. The way it works, as I mentioned earlier, the classic psychedelics is by activating this subtype of serotonin receptor, serotonin 2A. Now, there's a lot to figure out, but what we know so far is that signals certain so-called post-receptor signaling pathways. I won't go into the details, but it causes a certain reaction in the neuron, the brain cell, that's different than what is caused by serotonin, the natural ligand or the natural neurotransmitter that normally fits into that receptor. But it starts a cascade that's different than serotonin normally causes. And it has a different propagation it causes a different pattern of communication across different neurons. So there's this chain of activity. And there's ultimately, at a higher level of analysis, there appears to be dramatic effects in the way that the brain communicates with itself. So you get this change in so-called brain network activity. That just means the synchronization across brain areas. So you see two major things. You see brain areas that their activity is not synchronized. In other words, it's not correlated, which is really a proxy for how much communication is likely going on. But brain areas that aren't communicating much, that are normally kind of, distant, they're kind of compartmentalized. They're doing their own subroutines, so to speak. Now, all of a sudden, their activity is more coordinated. On the other hand, you also see where some areas that are normally well synchronized, so they're normally communicating with each other, they're not communicating with each other anymore. So by analogy, I kind of describe it as perhaps sort of like the effect of the internet on society. Maybe, years ago, it was more likely that you knew your neighbors well, but, the chances of you knowing someone well in another country were very small. Now, there's good and there's bad. Now at the internet, maybe you're less likely to know your next door neighbor, but now your best friend is in Pakistan, or, you're part of some hobby, and you interact with people all throughout the world. And so it's sort of like the internet that's sort of scrambled up those normal patterns of communication. And like with psychedelics, I would say the analogy holds that the internet, there's plenty of good, with the right safeguards, and there's plenty of bad that comes with that change in communication.
So thank you very much. It's really fascinating the way you explain the substances. And in order to continue, could you talk about what distinguishes psychedelics from other psychoactive substances, such as nicotine, caffeine or cannabis?
Mm-hmm. So I think the biggest difference is they do have that relatively strong change in the sense of self, and the interaction between the self and reality. And so usually with these other substances, it's more of an altercation of one's normal experience. So for example, on a stimulant, whether it's cocaine or even caffeine, it's more of a normal variation on a theme. Okay, so one knows who they are, they know what's happening, the world seems relatively same, but they're a little more active, they're a little more stimulated, and especially with cocaine, they're happier. But people know what it's like to be happy, so it's sort of it's within more of a normal range. It's an extreme experience, but not as extreme with the psychedelic. And so, for example, alcohol or other sedatives with opioids, it's again, people feel different, but it's more alike. If someone's never drank alcohol before, you could sort of describe, well, it's kind of like when you feel really, really sleepy. It's something like that. And again, they're just like cocaine, like, yeah, there's some euphoria, so you feel happy. You often feel a little happier, more relaxed. People know what that's like generally. And so with psychedelics, people will often say this is just unlike what they've experienced before. There's just this profoundly different way in which the brain is organizing its perception of reality. We also know that there's one of the multiple theories is that there's called this thalamic gating theory, where the thalamus has a role in sort of like channeling traffic from the outside and the inside stimuli of the world. And sort of there's this scrambling of what it may be that you're now experiencing internal events, such as one's own memories, one's own feelings and sensations, in a way that now resembles how one normally experiences the external world. So there's this more fundamental scrambling of one's core of experience, and that's not there with these other drugs. I will say as a caveat that cannabis, more so in the older days, the 1970s, it was more likely for people to call cannabis a minor psychedelic. And I would say that's a fair description, because depending on someone's amount of tolerance and habituation to it, cannabis can have psychedelic type qualities, typically less extreme, but somewhat along those dimensions, as the classic psychedelic. So perhaps that's somewhere in the middle. But that's how I would say it's just this fundamental kind of alteration of one's experience with reality, which might underlie why, both in the right setting, it could have potential therapeutic value, because in this change, one may be able to view themselves from this very different perspective, And perhaps part of that is helpful. Perhaps one sees themselves, has more insight about their own problems. Perhaps one views their situation from a different vantage point where they could have more perhaps empathy for themselves like they would for another person. Perhaps they can appreciate certain problems that they've had from sort of a distance and take a different perspective on it. But then also that kind of scrambling of reality can go along with, they could have a delusional experience. And in the hands of someone who is particularly, let's say, like a cult leader or something like this, these can be used to push people in a very negative direction. It appeared, for example, the Charles Manson, who was the mass murderer that had a cult that he encouraged in the United States back in the late 60s. He encouraged his followers to kill these people. It appeared that he used LSD to help, you could call it brainwash, to influence. It wasn't the only thing. I think they were likely people that were very susceptible to falling into a cult, which is a certain personality type. But I think in combination with that, he used these drugs to kind of warp people. And there is evidence that generally people are made more susceptible or more suggestible, so more pliable, and the brain is more flexible, so more susceptible to influence. So that could be good or bad depending on the intention and the surroundings that they are in.
So thank you for addressing this critical point of suggestibility. It's really crucial in talking about generally on psychedelics. And I would like to ask you, what are some of the fundamental ethical considerations surrounding the therapeutic use of psychedelics in clinical settings, of course?
I think, as I said before, there are dangers. So I think it's ethically important to make sure people don't show signs of disorders that could be made worse. I mentioned heart disease, but another one on the psychiatric category is schizophrenia and other so-called psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. It appears through clinical observation over the decades that people who may have those disorders, or even an identifiable predisposition, in other words, they don't have the disorder yet, but they're showing early signs of it, it may be that these drugs could exacerbate or quicken, bring on the full disorder. It certainly doesn't appear from our evidence, and now thousands of people in the earlier and modern era, that you're going to make someone that doesn't have that predisposition, that you're going to make them schizophrenic. But can you worsen or exacerbate, accelerate the schizophrenic, the psychotic process for people with that vulnerability? It appears likely so. I think we know too much to do a clinical trial. We know enough that that's a possibility, that it would be unethical to say, oh, give me 100 people with early signs of schizophrenia and we'll give half of them LSD and half of them not. Because that would be unethical, because there's a good chance you are going to make those schizophrenic patients worse. So I think it's, now there's also anecdotes of some people saying it's helped with their schizophrenia. Perhaps, we don't know. I would say that's not the first place you want to start in research. If that's ever explored, it needs to be extremely cautious with, and being ready to stop the research at the first sign of that you've made someone worse. So that's one of the ethics. You screen your subjects, severe heart disease, schizophrenia. Those are the main things in terms of screening. There's also, I think, in terms of ethics, informed consent, it's a challenge, given what I've described, to really inform someone what they're getting into. Pretty commonly, people will say after the experience that no matter what you could have said, you could have never fully prepared me for what this was like. So how do you navigate that with informed consent? One of the things I do is I tell people that itself. I tell people in a study that, oh, I've had lots of people who have done this and then said, there's nothing you could have told me that could have fully prepared me. So just knowing that itself, I think, is ethically important, that you may be signing up for something that you even can't fully appreciate. I think it's important to let people know about that. I've also let people know that I've had even combat military veterans that say this was even more frightening than their combat experience. I mean, that's a very humbling analogy. And so you let people know like how intense that some people, not always, but sometimes this can be, and not always on the positive side. So you have to warn people about how scary. And I think we don't have evidence that those scary experiences harm the type of screened participants that I'm talking about, if they're kept safe and they're supported through the experience. But nonetheless, in the wrong environment, if someone wasn't monitored, even though it is relatively rare when people use these recreationally, sometimes people have a panic reaction at a concert. They get extremely afraid, and and sometimes they hurt themselves or others. Sometimes they, again, rare, so I don't want to overstate it, but people have died, like they do with other intoxicating substances. I mean, alcohol, and any other intoxicating substance, it can, in the wrong environment, someone can have a fatal event. Even though, again, it probably is very rare, but there are some credible reports where it appears that the person may have thought they could fly and they jumped from a height. And I know we're kind of used to thinking of that as maybe hyperbole. And again, we don't know how rare. It certainly doesn't appear to be normal or typical by any stretch, but there are cases that look like that. And so it's there was a American comedian, Bill Hicks, who would joke about it, to say, if that's your theory, test it while being on the ground. If you think you can fly, at least start. In other words, don't be near a height. You can try to jump, but you're probably not going to go very high. So I don't mean to, make light of the reality, though, that, this can be, these are very intoxicating substances. So there's an ethics to monitoring people when you're doing research or medical practice. If they're approved for medicine by the EMA, by the FDA, if they're approved for medical practice, they need to be monitored, at least these high dose sessions that have been explored so far. And then really the final category is I'm increasingly concerned about the degree to which these experiences can be used to shape metaphysical beliefs. And I'm a strong believer that unless it's sacramental use by one of the religions that I mentioned, or if it's incorporated into a religion, I wouldn't tell any of these religions. There's lots of religions. There's a Native American church. There's the Santo Daime and the UDV from South America that have ayahuasca or peyote as part of their religion. This is not advice to them, but if you're a psychologist or a physician that's using these in treatment, I think it's extremely important not to sort of fill in the blanks on the big metaphysical questions about the nature of God, the nature of reality, any of the number of theories that, people think that these psychedelic experiences, that some people believe that they're really encountering, some other disincarnated intelligence. They believe it's an experience of God. From a shamanic perspective, they may believe it's plant spirits, that they're, maybe the spirit of the mushroom. I just think on all of this, our role isn't to deny any of that, whether it's, Jesus speaking to them or a plant spirit. I think it's to really, on anything like that, to really let the patient make any determination, if any, on those dimensions. Because I really think there's a chance to push people into a cult-like behavior. And I think that even relatively mainstream researchers and clinicians can fall into this, to the kind of the trap of what I call playing guru. And I've been in over 100 of these sessions with people in that room, and it is humbling to think you've been part of what someone may call afterwards, and so they sometimes do say, that was the most meaningful experience of my life. That's a very extreme thing that very few people have the privilege of having any association with. So I'm really concerned that can go to your head, as a clinician or as a scientist who's there, that you can take advantage of that in more extreme ways, such as inappropriate sexual relationships, for example, between clinician and patient, or even or kind of more religious cult-like behavior, where the doctor sort of becomes the guru or the priest, and they're kind of the access to God or the divine, and or even more subtle ways where they're kind of held as the kind of the sage, the oracle for filling in those blanks for people. And I think I'm very concerned about where that's going to go. And so that's actually the risk that I think is not talked about very much at all. And I think we need to talk more. I've been trying to raise awareness around that aspects of the ethics.
Okay, so let's delve more on the role of set and setting. So we mean mindset and the environment. Which role do they play in the ethical administration of psychedelics?
So it appears they play a very strong role. This goes along with the suggestibility that I mentioned earlier. Obviously, if a drug makes you more suggestible, then the environment, the people you're with, and even your own mindset coming in, which is the set, as you mentioned, are even more important than with other drugs. We know with all psychoactive substances, the context plays an important role, even for something like caffeine and alcohol, but it's just much more so with these psychedelic compounds. So in terms of providing helpful, positive, potentially medically useful, psychologically useful experiences in this research and in potential future medical use, it's important to have a pleasing environment. It seems that one is more likely to have a very challenging experience, one of those frightful experiences I mentioned, if they're in a chaotic environment, an ugly environment. So it's very important to have that. And the most important aspect, I think, is the people. Physical environment is important too, but I would guess that the most important is that, someone is with people that they trust. The worst thing I think you could have happen is the person starting to wonder, oh, what are these people's real intentions? Maybe I was just in this study. They're just seeing me as a guinea pig. They really don't care about me. Maybe they're studying something they haven't told me about. And unfortunately, there is a history. The United States CIA was using these drugs in some unethical research as part of the MK Ultra program. They even gave it to US citizens without their knowledge and observed them. And so obviously unethical. And so unfortunately, there's actually a history. It's not necessarily foolish for someone's mind to go there, because this has happened. And so it's really, really important to just build a rapport, which is why in that preparation before you give the substance, that the therapists get to know the individual. There's a rapport building so that they can trust that this is a human being that is caring for my well-being. So that's, I think, the most important part of set and setting.
No, indeed, these are crucial points, let's say. But how do therapists ensure that the setting is conducive to a safe and transformative psychedelic experience?
Well, one part of the set and setting, I think, that helps with that, that's typically been used in the research, is to have an introspective framework. And so this is by having the person wear eye shades, so a eye mask that covers their eyes during most of the experience. So, and the general point of that is to focus their attention inward. The idea is that someone could get sort of stuck at appreciating the pretty colors because perception is enhanced, and sometimes they might feel like, oh, that painting on the wall is kind of moving, and the walls are moving. Not always, but many people have perceptual effects like that, and that can be fascinating for people. But the idea is, if you spend too much kind of focus on that, you may not go to kind of deeper psychological levels. So the eye mask, the intention is to help with that, to kind of focus on the internal experience. And there's also music that's used. Person typically wears headphones, and so a music program is played of music that can support them. And there's a rich scientific literature, and it's most people's common everyday experience that music can play a powerful role in shaping your emotions and providing some structure and something to affect your mood, and to even like have an evocative effect, to kind of make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, to give you goosebumps, to have that kind of emotional effect. And so, the music is part of that setting too. So that's something that therapists can do to help that the intention. This is more about sort of, I guess, so that the therapeutic intention, like if you come in there to quit smoking or to quit alcohol, or to focus on your depression, really whatever it is, that if you kind of have this more of this internal focus, have a supportive musical structure to it, the idea is that they may be able to focus and have their experience to be more relevant to those issues than to just, again, being distracted by the interesting perceptual effects.
So in order to summarize the effects of these substances, could you briefly talk about, the risk and the benefits of these substances, really briefly, in order to summarize and to better understand their effects, their potential therapeutic effects?
Mm-hmm. So for some people have, they could have the risk of heart disease, schizophrenia, or predisposition. But also on the risk side, and I didn't mention this before, but anybody, no matter how psychologically healthy, if you don't have that support, you could have that bad trip and panic in public. And so that's important for anyone. You don't have to be psychiatrically unhealthy, let's say, in order to have that happen. So that's part of the risk side. And some people would never want this experience. You describe these extreme experiences, and some people would say that's not for me. So informed consent is important. So that's all on the potential risk side. And then you have, on the benefit side, we're seeing preliminary evidence suggesting it may be helpful for dealing with cancer-related distress, for major depressive disorder, and for different forms of addiction. And there's some other things being explored. We don't have a lot of, there's a lot of studies going on now that we don't know the results of. One other thing that's been published is some early positive evidence for helping long-term AIDS survivors to overcome the demoralization that they've experienced, with many people in their community having died of AIDS, and kind of the survivors' guilt associated with that. But other things are being explored, so we'll have to see. But it's that's risk benefit. We'll see if those things hold up. And of course, there's a standard for, by the European, the EMA, or the FDA in the United States, for so-called phase 3 trials, to say, hey, is this ultimately in larger trials safe and efficacious? In other words, do you not harm people, and do you actually help improve the disorder that you're claiming it helps? And so we're not there yet. We're probably closest in the United States to MDMA being approved for PTSD. We may be within a year of that. This depends on the FDA's final decision, but they've completed all of the phase 3 work that is setting up that decision.
So this was for, let's say, the clinical application of the substances. But what about non-clinical application of the substances? I mean, what ethical challenges arise when considering the societal impact of a broader use of psychedelics beyond clinical settings?
Right. I think it's important to warn people about those same risks. I mean, they are there. If you go to any other setting, if you just, take some mushrooms with your friends, if you, go to one of the things, there's all these increasing retreat centers or people going to Peru, for example, to have a shamanistic experience. So unlike the clinical work, there's just more of an unknown there. So like you might see a shaman who's like a very good person and is keeping people safe and is, or you might, and there have been horror stories of people being sexually abused and, them kind of like taking advantage and getting you to give them all of your money and kind of sucking you into some sort of cult-like relationship. So, buyer beware, so people are sort of on their own to figure that out. I don't encourage anyone to use these substances. There are dangers. But I also recognize that people do use these substances. So I think it's important to tell people here's what we know scientifically about the riskiest use and less risky use. So if someone is using, it's all else being equal, it's better not to be alone. It's better be with people you trust than with a bunch of strangers or with being alone. It's better to know and this is also something you don't have to worry about in the clinical research, is that, it's important to know the purity of your substance. Is this even what you think it is? Which, of course, in the black market, you don't know. And even with ayahuasca in South America, there's a wide variety. Sometimes tobacco is put in and consumed orally, sometimes coca, which contains cocaine, and other, a wide variety. Many shamans have their own little recipe. And, so there could be who knows what's going to be in there that might even be, for a particular individual more dangerous than the ayahuasca, the DMT itself, and what's known about the dose. And so there's people there's also, and it's important to remind people as this has become more popular, for most places on the planet, there's also a legal risk. I mean, these are in most places, and like United States, Schedule 1 drugs, and similar in the European nations. Even the Netherlands technically only tolerates even, and it's technically illegal because they're assigned to these same international treaties. I believe mushrooms are only perhaps there may be exceptions, but in Jamaica, I don't think there's any law at all against mushroom. Nonetheless, in most places you go to, there's a legal risk. So, I mean, for example, a few years ago, one, I think, Silicon Valley tech company in the United States, the CEO was bragging about, microdosing, and then he was fired. And, just well, your board of directors, you just told the world you're using an illicit drug, and that's a problem, and so whether you agree or disagree with that legal framework, I remind people it exists. And so if you use these things in a non-legal circumstance, there's a risk of being caught, and that can have and especially depending on your what country you're in, and even within the United States, there's huge variability across the different states of what that consequence could be. So that's also not to be forgotten, even though it's so hip. It's still usually illegal.
Of course. So how can legal framework address the responsible use or potential misuse of psychedelics?
How can the legal framework support the responsible use or minimize the misuse? Yeah, so I'm a big believer in harm reduction. I think you can treat people honestly, and by analogy, teenagers, you could tell them, yes, you're safest not having sex, but if you do, use condoms, keep yourself protected, the same way that, yes, you're safest not injecting drugs. But I think it's ethical to say, but if you do, don't use a dirty needle. You don't want to catch HIV and hepatitis. So in the same framework, I do think that I would advise governments to inform, especially in the United States, where some of the states are starting to decriminalize or even in some cases legalize, such as in Oregon, which is really interesting because it's still federally illegal. So it's a very bizarre landscape. But I think it's, especially in those circumstances, I wish the governments did more of saying, hey, look, just because we're saying we don't think it's best to give you a criminal penalty if you get caught doing this, doesn't mean it's safe. So I wish there was more of an emphasis of, hey, we've decriminalized it because we think, that's making things worse by giving people criminal records, putting them in prison, et cetera. But there are dangers, and here they are. I wish there was more of an emphasis on, if you are going to use, we don't recommend you use, but if you are, here are the major dangers. And here's what separates the riskiest use from less risky use. I think there's a way to do this to really ethically, again, not encourage people. And I try very carefully to not encourage people, because people reach out to me with horror stories. I mean, these are powerful substances, and there can be very, very real harm. And so, I think about that a lot, and I want to be very careful with people.
Well, indeed, it is really important for us to have public awareness campaigns in order to educate and inform about people about these substances. But according to you, how can we mitigate misinformation and sensationalism surrounding psychedelics in popular culture nowadays?
Well, one thing, thinking just for myself as a scientist, I think we need to do a better. I mean, there are limits on time, but I think if the media wants to talk to you about this stuff, I think you should talk to them, even if it's a venue that you think may be, I don't know, maybe not so serious. I think for example, once I was asked to be on the Dr. Oz show, which, people have many opinions about, but hey, they wanted, like it or not, there's a huge audience. And so it's like, it's better to hear from a scientist who can bring up, yes, there are dangers, but there's also very real, so far in the right setting, benefits. So don't just dismiss the research, as some wild, reckless thing, but like, I wish society listened to science more in general. So when there is an opportunity, I encourage science to like make more efforts to be heard in public. So I certainly wish that we, for others, for journalists, I would always encourage them to reach out to at least one scientist, or, multiple, if they're writing a story. There's so many stories. It's so popular to write about this these days. And sometimes you just get stories where they're just asking, scientists, to be clear, aren't the only people. I mean, there are, for example, ethicists are extremely important. So ask, and it's also important to ask regular people that have used and are making claims of one type or another. That's important too, but also ask the relevant professionals, including, I think, bioethicists. It'd be good if we saw that at increasing level, because I think those issues are becoming more important. But so I think journalism can do a better job. I mean, some do a great job, but I think in general can do a better job at making sure that experts are represented, and to, avoid salacious headlines. Like, I'm really disappointed by the headlines, and the way I've learned that it's happened in journalism, it's usually not even the writer that interviewed you, it's the editor, or often it's the editor that makes the title. And so sometimes the writer of the story doesn't even like that title, but they want to get the title that's going to get the most clicks. And so I can encourage the editors out to kind of be more responsible, because sometimes it just even conflicts the information in the story that's right below. And more public forums for discussing. I think there's a lot of good meetings out there that have kind of presented, and they include inviting scientists and other professionals to talk to the public. I think those are good, if people are interested in this area, that they have an opportunity to learn about it from experts who are probably more likely to provide a balanced perspective on these things. Those are just some thoughts, but there could be a lot, I'm sure. It's a big question.
Of course, these are good thoughts. I mean, really valuable ones. So thank you, Dr. Johnson. And as we wrap up, we do have some questions from the audience. And someone is asking about the risks of MDMA. So which is, well, commonly known as the ecstasy, because it's more known as a drug for, I don't know, used by teenagers or...
Right,
so
it's
not
sort of
for-
easier to dance on than the mushrooms. So it's more likely to be used at, you know, at the club, at a
recreational use.
discotheque, at a music festival. So very briefly, so hopefully we get to multiple questions. It's a bit more of a risk physically. It's more concerned you know, for like at the heart level, because it's an amphetamine derivative, because it has that, so it has more of that stimulant effect that compared to mushrooms or LSD. And so there's a little more physiological risk, but there's actually less risk in terms of having a bad trip, because it's typically more of an emotional experience. It's less likely that one thinks that they've gone crazy, this type of thing. So.
Okay, so thank you very much. Then they are asking, what are the dangers of psychedelics in people affected by depersonalization or derealization disorder?
We don't really know. That falls into the category of, you know, these people would be excluded from most, if not all, clinical trials so far. So you know, I'm also mindful that some of the earlier research in the 50s, the 60s, early 70s, that whoever was even called a schizophrenia patient then, like the diagnostic criteria changed. So some of the people that, you know, these disorders that you're describing now, what would they have even been called by a particular mental health professional back in the early 60s? I mean, so, and it very well may be that those disorders can be worsened. I would assume that they can, but also like schizophrenia, who knows? I mean, perhaps in the right, as we learn more, perhaps these drugs could be used in the right way to leverage towards helping those people, but that's very speculative. And if that's ever researched, one would have to be extremely cautious with it. But I'd say there's certainly concern that someone could be made worse with those disorders.
Okay, so another really interesting question: what about the interaction with other substances, psychoactive substances or not? I mean, people used to mix, I don't know, LSD and alcohol, or...
Right. Well, it's typically not, it could only make things more dangerous. I think that's fair to say. Here's something very relevant. So some very serious analyses have been done with the tolerated mushroom use in the Netherlands. And now they technically tolerate the sclerotia, which are the truffles, which same thing, it's psilocybin, but it's a technicality. They don't allow the mushrooms themselves, but they allow essentially the roots of the mushroom. So same thing essentially. But very careful analyses have found the typical people that have gotten hurt and that have caused deaths and this type of thing, which is relatively rare. But when they happen, well, one, it's typically, you know, like young males coming over from Britain as tourists, but it's like combining with alcohol. I mean, so it's, you know, you combine these kind of you know, these radical alterations of reality, then you combine that with the disinhibition with alcohol, and that's a really bad combination, especially when you're walking around public, especially in a big city like Amsterdam. So I would guess that alcohol is probably the most dangerous thing. And I would just certainly say anything that also, for other drugs like the stimulants, cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine, you know, that's going to increase your risk of heart problems, of like, say, having a cardiac event, because there's at least somewhat of an increased cardiac response for, you know, the classic psychedelics and MDMA. So if you add other stimulants on top of board, you're increasing that risk.
Of course. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for shedding light on this complex ethical considerations. It's been an enlightening conversation. Thank you very much for
Oh,
being.
my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So in order to, I would like to make a little announcement. I'm excited to announce that our next webinar, part of the Osservatorio Culturale di Bioetica series, which will take place on the 23rd of November from 5 to 6 p.m. Rome time. And the theme for this engaging session is the Family Global Compact. So thank you all for your attention, and we look forward to your participation to our next webinar. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and thank you, Professor Alberto Garcia.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Thank you, Matthew. Keep in contact, and God bless you.
Will do. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.